Hi, it's Juliet. Welcome back to my studio. Today I'm going to show you how to make these really cute octopus beads for beads of courage. They're essentially two beads together. The little octopus is holding his treasure bead. There's a whole bunch of varieties of variations you can make for the base bead, and then you can kind of go to town with the octopus, his colors, his eyes, and we'll learn how to give him a particular expression. So make sure when you're making beads for beads of courage that you use a larger size mandrel. That way the kids have an easier time stringing it. So what we're going to be doing is making an octopus, and it's going to be holding a bead or a treasure. And we're going to make the treasure first, and then we are going to apply the octopus and add his tendrils to it. So the base bead will be on the left. Eventually on the right, we're going to be making his head. And so we want to leave enough room on the right side of the mandrel for his head. For now, I'm just going to wind on a base bead in clear. And this is what he's holding, and his octopus tentacles will be wrapping around this. So the size of it is sort of going to determine to a certain degree how big your bead is going to be. You get to decide how far around it his tentacles are going to wrap. You know, if it's a small bead, they'll probably wrap all the way around it relative to the size of the octopus head. If it's a big bead, maybe they only go part way around it. But those are all decisions you get to make. And I'm just using a Frit 004, an inexpensive clear for this, because we're going to be covering it all with Frit. You could also decorate it with opaque stringers, dots and stripes, or swirls, or whatever you want. Just something that has some visual interest. Okay, so that's rounded up, and I want to let it harden a little bit before I go dipping into my Frit, because if it's really soft to the core, that will distort the shape, and it can be difficult to round it back up. You can check if it's hard by listening to it. So next what we want to do is just soften up a top millimeter or so, enough that we can pick up the Frit the whole way around it. So once I've got the top, or the outer surface of it, I'm going to tap into my Frit and wind it in there and pick some up. Now I like to use an au jus Frit bowl to hold my Frit, and I create like a little mountain. That way I'll push it and make a little mountain. That way my glass will touch it and my rod won't be, so I don't risk either getting Frit stuck on my rod or, even worse, getting bead release into my stash of Frit. And then I grabbed a clear stringer, and we're going to just put some little swirls in it here and there to just give it a little bit of visual interest. Make it look a little more precious, like the octopus is guarding it. Okay, so to get a bigger footprint of swirls, I like to heat up the tip of my stringer and then just tap it down on a marver or my torch head or something to make that little landing spot. I don't know if you can see that in the picture. A little landing spot on the end. So then what we're going to do is heat up just a section of glass and touch it down and just make a twist. And then melt that off. Since the base is clear too, you won't see that stringer, you'll just see the neat twist. That landing pad helps grab glass from in a wider area, so it gives you a broader, wider twist. And the more you heat it, the wider the area of glass is pulled into the twisting action. If you want a small twist, you only heat a little bit of an area. If you want a wider twist, you can kind of heat from a couple angles over, a larger 2D surface of the bead. After I flame cut it, I kind of touch it down on my marver and make my little landing pad for the next one, so it's all ready to go. You can make any kind of a decorated base bead that you want. You could use them to practice your dots or swirls or zigzags, or use leftover bits of twisties or little short bits of glass, whatever you want. Okay, so there is the treasure that the octopus is going to be holding. And next we will work on the octopus head. Okay, so the octopus head I'm going to make out of an opaque white glass. So I am going to join it up to the treasure bead. And I want it to make sure it's joined real well. So I'm going to heat up my mandrel in the area I'm touching it down, and I'm going to touch down a bit of glass and wind it on pretty close to this. But I want there to be no gap between them, but I don't want them all to blend in and be the same diameter. So I'm touching down and I'm winding it around. And then I want to heat that up pretty well so that it flows towards the treasure bead and melds into it so that there is no gap in there. Because when you go to take it off the mandrel, if there's a gap, it's a weak spot and it can break into two. So, you know, that looks a little ugly right now. It certainly doesn't have a nice bead pucker, but I don't have enough glass, so I'm not too worried about that. I'm going to add a little bit more glass. So see, there's one spot there. There was still a bit of bead release showing. So I'm going to build this up. And at this point, you can kind of build it up more like just like a disc, I guess you'd call it. And then let that melt down. And again, what we're working on is getting the join between the octopus body and the treasure bead so that the glass is melted and fused together really solidly. So you'll see I'm holding my mandrel at an angle, and that's letting gravity pull the white down towards the treasure bead and let it melt into it. And when the white is hot, it's clear, so you can kind of see straight through the mandrel. It's nice. I don't have any bubbles in there. Yay. And it's pushed up against the treasure bead, so that's pretty good. So at this point now I can build it up a little bit more. So you need to decide now how big of the head of the octopus do you want to make and how long are his tendrils. So I want to make a little bit bigger octopus and have long tendrils that wrap around the treasure bead more. So I'm going to widen my footprint a bit. So again, I find it's easier if you add the glass sort of as if you were building a disc and then melt it in. It's a little easier to control it. And then that also helps preserve that distinction between the treasure bead and the head of the octopus. So that's softening, melting down, and rounding up. At this point, you can also take one of the narrower sides of your stump shaper and marver in there a little bit if you need to keep it cool. So if the white is getting a little too soft in between the two, that's a good way to do that. A little unbalanced, so I'm going to add a little bit more glass to the one side. But we need to get more heat in there so that the glass naturally rounds up. All right, that looks pretty good. I'm going to just marver that gap between them just a little bit, just to keep the definition, and I'm going to use the edge of my stump shaper. All right, so next we're going to add the octopus tendrils. And to do that, I'm going to use a plain white stringer. So I'm going to start the tendrils on the left side and work to the right, and then I can flame cut it when it gets onto the opaque white. And since I'm using, just pulled plain stringers, and this is plain white, the glass is going to match. It's going to melt right in. So any, cut off ends, you can just melt that glass in and it will disappear. So octopus have 8 feet. So if you think about, or 8 legs, we think about it, if you go east, west, north, south, and then you go in between northeast, northwest, southwest, southeast, that'll give you 8 evenly distributed around there. So if I think about how long his legs want to come down, they probably want to go just a little bit past the crest of the treasure bead, and that's about the right length of leg for the size head. So I'm going to put a little bitty base heat in here, and I'm going to get the tip warm, touch it down just past the crest, and then make sure you push into that gap and then flame cut it. So that's one. Then I'm going to go to the opposite, push it down into that gap and flame cut it. At this point, you may want to take your tool and push it in there a little bit, especially if it didn't quite go all the way in. We're not going to worry about these ends right here yet. We can melt those in later. So that's north and south. Let's now add an east and the west tendril, and I'm pushing it down in that gap. And while it's hot, if I need to, I can use a tool and kind of poke it in there a little more securely. And they don't all have to be even. You can put a few closer together or further apart, depending on if you don't want to cover up some of the detail on the treasure bead. You can decide where to put them. All right, so let's melt that in so that all of those little ends melt into the base glass. And this is a good time to also put a little bit of heat on the bottom end. I'm aiming it pretty much at the mandrel. You'll see the ends of his legs or his tendrils are melting in a bit. So we don't want them sticking out or a risk of breaking off. So let me heat that gap there between the head and the treasure bead. And I'm going to, again, just kind of clean that definition up just a little bit using my stump shaper. Now I'm going to go back in and work on heating up where those are melted into the head of the octopus. So I want to get enough heat in there till they fully melt in and you can't tell that we kind of extended them up to there. At this point you could also marver it on a marvering pad like that and then re-round it. That blended them in pretty good, and now the shape is a little off, so we will reheat that and let gravity pull that back into and the surface tension pull that back into a nice round head. Okay, so we have the treasure bead with the tendrils and his head. Now we're going to add some eyes. So I am going to give this guy some blue eyes. So I have a rod of blue here. You could also use a stringer. I'm going to put down 2 dots for the eyes, and then they're going to have some white on it and little black pupils. So 1 big eye dot and another big eye dot. And you can either leave them raised a little bit or melt them down somewhat. I'm going to kind of flatten them out a bit with my dental tool. Melt that other one in a little bit more to get the size to match a bit better. Okay, now I'm going to take a piece of white stringer and add 2 white dots in the center of the blue. This part I definitely want to melt in some more. Don't forget to keep some heat in your treasure bead. Flatten that in a bit. If you need to kind of scooch something one way or the other to make the eyes balance, this is an easy way to do that. And then I'm going to take a bit of black stringer and make a couple of little pupils. And I'm adding them kind of off center, but I'm adding them both sort of the same. So he's looking in a particular direction and he's not cross-eyed. And it's really handy to use the dental tool to kind of get his expression lined up. So there we go. One little octopus ready for the kiln. Thanks for watching.
Don't forget to subscribe if you like this video and check out the rest of the videos in the playlist Lampwork with Juliet. Also be sure to click on that little link up in the top right corner to see how to make a jellyfish.